Do you know? In the early hours of February 28, 2026, air raid sirens tore through Tehran, and within 12 hours, nearly 900 strikes had fallen across Iran. By the time the smoke cleared, one of the men who had shaped the Middle East for almost 4 decades was dead. What most viewers don't know is what came after, not the war itself, but the confession, months later, from inside Iran's own military establishment, that changed how the entire world understands what was actually destroyed and what wasn't. This is the story of how a shadow war fought in the dark for 30 years finally exploded into the open, and why, even now, nobody can say with certainty whether the threat it was meant to end has actually ended at all. To understand what happened in 2026, you have to go back further, to a conflict that was never declared but never really stopped. For more than 3 decades, Israel treated Iran's nuclear program as an existential problem to be managed by any means short of open war. Centrifuges failed mysteriously. Scientists were killed in ambushes on the streets of Tehran. In 2010, a computer worm known as Stuxnet, widely attributed to a joint American-Israeli operation, though never officially acknowledged by either government, physically wrecked centrifuges at the Natanz enrichment facility by making them spin themselves apart. In 2020, Mohsen Fakhrizadeh, the scientist Israeli officials described as the architect of Iran's weapons research, was killed in an operation that Iranian authorities said used an AI-assisted remote weapon. A year earlier, Israeli intelligence agents had smuggled roughly half a ton of Iran's secret nuclear archives out of a Tehran warehouse. None of this was war in the conventional sense. It was attrition, aimed at buying time rather than settling the question permanently. Iran, for its part, insisted throughout that its nuclear work was peaceful and that uranium enrichment was a sovereign right enshrined in the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which it has been a signatory to since 1970. Israel's fear was never abstract. Iranian officials, including past presidents, had repeatedly called for Israel's destruction, and Israeli leaders across the political spectrum treated a nuclear-armed Iran as the single greatest threat to their country's existence, sitting as it does within range of Iranian ballistic missiles and hosting a population of roughly 9 million people in a territory smaller than many American states. Foreign policy analysts have long warned that the danger was never only about a direct nuclear strike, which most experts considered unlikely given the near certainty of Israeli and American retaliation against a country that would not survive it. The deeper worry was what strategists call the shadow effect of possession itself. A nuclear-armed Iran could act more aggressively through its network of regional proxies in Lebanon, Gaza, Syria, and Yemen, confident that its own territory was now protected by the ultimate deterrent. There was also the fear of contagion. Saudi Arabia's own leadership had signaled for years that if Iran crossed the nuclear threshold, it would feel compelled to pursue the same capability, potentially triggering a proliferation cascade across one of the world's most unstable regions. It is this web of consequences, rather than a single feared moment, that explains why Israeli governments of every political stripe treated Iran's program as a problem to be solved by any means available, including operations that stopped just short of open war for the better part of 3 decades. The diplomatic track that was supposed to settle the dispute peacefully came in 2015, when Iran and 6 world powers signed the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, capping Iran's uranium enrichment at 3.67% purity, far below weapons grade, in exchange for sanctions relief. It held imperfectly until 2018, when the first Trump administration withdrew the United States from the agreement and reimposed sanctions. Iran did not immediately abandon its restraint, but over the following years, it steadily walked back its commitments, and by the early 2020s, it was enriching uranium to 60%, a technical step away from the roughly 90% purity considered weapons grade. The International Atomic Energy Agency, the United Nations nuclear watchdog, continued inspections under Iran's baseline safeguards agreement, but its access to the fuller monitoring regime the JCPOA had required was gone. By the time Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu was warning in early 2026 that Iran was quietly working to restart parts of its weapons-relevant research, the IAEA itself could not fully verify what was happening inside facilities like Fordo, buried under a mountain near Qom, precisely because so much of the intrusive inspection regime had lapsed years earlier. That uncertainty is what makes June 2025 the hinge point of this story. On June 13th of that year, Israel launched a surprise 12-day campaign of airstrikes against Iranian nuclear and military sites, hitting the enrichment halls at Natanz, structures at the Isfahan nuclear complex, and, according to independent satellite analysis from the Institute for Science and International Security, causing significant damage that the IAEA itself later confirmed at both Natanz and Isfahan. Iran responded with ballistic missile strikes on Israeli territory. The exchange lasted less than 2 weeks before a ceasefire took hold, but it fundamentally changed the calculus on both sides. Israeli officials described it afterward as proof that Iran's program could be set back through direct military force. Independent assessments were more cautious. Experts monitoring the facilities noted that a significant stockpile of uranium enriched to 60%, which had existed before the strikes, could not be fully accounted for afterward, raising a question that would hang over the next year of reporting. Had that material been destroyed, buried under rubble, or quietly moved somewhere else before the bombs fell? That unresolved question is a large part of why, 8 months later, the war restarted on a far larger scale. Through the second half of 2025, U.S. intelligence assessments described Iran attempting to rebuild parts of its nuclear infrastructure deeper underground, reinforcing a facility at the Parchin military complex with what analysts called a concrete sarcophagus designed to withstand future airstrikes. Netanyahu told American media at the end of 2025 that he believed Iran was trying to revive both its missile production and its nuclear ambitions, though he added that he was not certain Tehran had yet decided to cross what he called the line toward an actual weapon. That phrase, the line or the red line, has followed Israeli warnings about Iran for well over a decade, dating back to Netanyahu's now famous 2012 address to the United Nations. It is a political framing as much as a technical one, and by early 2026, it was about to be tested in a way nobody fully anticipated. On February 28, 2026, the United States and Israel launched a joint military campaign that dwarfed anything that had come before it, striking missile sites, air defenses, military infrastructure, and in a strike whose target set had not been publicly disclosed in advance. The location where Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, was believed to be present. Iranian state media initially insisted Khamenei remained in command. 2 days later, on March 1st, Iranian state television confirmed his death and announced a 40-day mourning period. He was 86 years old and had led the Islamic Republic since 1989. It was, by any measure, an extraordinary event. The first time in the history of the Islamic Republic that its supreme leader had been killed, and one of the most consequential decapitation strikes against a national government in modern history. Iran's Revolutionary Guards responded by threatening to close the Strait of Hormuz, the narrow waterway through which roughly a fifth of the world's oil trade passes, and strikes were reported reaching as far as Abu Dhabi and Dubai. In the chaos, Iran's own line of succession collapsed almost as fast as its leadership. Within the war's opening days, more than 40 Iranian officials were reported killed, including Ali Larijani, who had been running day-to-day operations of the government and was, according to reporting at the time, targeted as the most senior surviving official after Khamenei himself. An interim leadership council was announced within a day, and by the following month, Khamenei's own son, Mojtaba Khamenei, had emerged as his successor as supreme leader, a transition with no precedent in the Islamic Republic's history, since the country had never before had to replace a supreme leader through anything other than a managed process following a natural death. What is important, and what separates confirmed fact from contested claim in this story, is what the strikes on the nuclear program itself actually achieved. 4 identified strikes targeted nuclear-related sites during the February campaign, a covert facility northeast of Tehran that Israel had been monitoring since the 2025 war, entrances to the enrichment halls at Natanz, structures at Isfahan, and a laboratory complex linked to Iran's nuclear weapons administrative body. Independent satellite analysis confirmed damage at 3 of the 4 sites, and the IAEA verified strikes at Natanz and Isfahan specifically. Analysts who track Iran's program closely, including researchers speaking to CNN in the weeks after the campaign, described a deliberate strategy that went beyond hitting physical infrastructure, targeting the human expertise behind it. More than a dozen of Iran's top nuclear scientists and academics were killed in the operation. Among them, physicist Mohammad Mehdi Taranchi, one of the country's most senior nuclear researchers. Strikes also reportedly hit university departments, specialized machinery suppliers, and even steel plants that fed into the broader industrial supply chain the program depended on. The stated logic, according to people familiar with the campaign's planning, was that Iran's knowledge and industrial base, not just its buildings, needed to be dismantled if the threat was to be permanently reduced, rather than simply delayed a second time, as many believed the 2025 strikes had done. And yet even this aggressive campaign left the central mystery unresolved. Because the 2025 strikes had already disrupted much of Iran's active enrichment capacity, the February 2026 campaign reportedly did not treat the nuclear facilities themselves as its primary target in the way the missile and leadership networks were. That decision, according to defense analysts who briefed on the aftermath, reflected an uncomfortable reality. Nobody could say with confidence where Iran's pre-existing stockpile of highly enriched uranium actually was. Some of it was believed to remain buried within the damaged tunnels at Fordo and Isfahan, unreachable but also unusable in its current state. Some might have been moved before either round of strikes began. Defense officials described active discussions about deploying special operations forces specifically to locate and secure this material, out of concern that, in the chaos of a collapsing government, it could fall into the hands of actors nobody could predict or control. Nearly 6 months after the February campaign, that material has still not been publicly accounted for, and no independent inspection has confirmed its location or status. By June 2026, exhaustion on all sides produced a fragile diplomatic opening. A memorandum of understanding, reportedly mediated in part through Pakistan, established a 60-day framework for negotiations covering Iran's nuclear program, the lifting of sanctions, and broader regional security arrangements. For a moment, it looked as though the war that had killed a supreme leader and reshaped the regional order might end in a negotiated settlement rather than further destruction. Vice President J.D. Vance stated publicly that the United States believed it had completed what he called its central mission of denying Iran a nuclear weapons capability. Iran's own deputy foreign minister, in comments reported by Al Jazeera in mid-June, said Tehran wanted peace extended to every front, explicitly including Gaza, and argued that Lebanon's inclusion in the emerging framework reflected how interconnected the region's conflicts had become. Even the Gulf Arab states, which had spent decades wary of Iranian influence, largely welcomed the truce, less out of sympathy for Tehran than out of fear that continued fighting would keep spilling across their own borders and further damage economies already reeling from the war's disruption to regional trade and energy markets. The economic toll on Iran itself was severe by any measure. The International Monetary Fund projected the country's economy would contract by more than 6% in 2026, its sharpest downturn since the 1980s, with inflation approaching 70%. That truce did not hold. By later in the summer, the memorandum had collapsed, and both the United States and Israel resumed military operations against Iran, with each side accusing the other of violating the agreed pause. The reasons for the collapse remain genuinely contested, with each government offering a different account of who broke the arrangement first. An independent verification of either narrative has been difficult, given the chaos still surrounding Iran's fractured post-Khamenei leadership. What is not contested is the human cost that followed. In the first weekend of August 2026, 3 American service members were killed in strikes in Jordan and Iraq, part of a pattern of retaliatory attacks against U.S. forces in the region that officials linked to Iranian-aligned militias. And then, on August 5th, came the detail that reframed the entire debate over whether Iran's nuclear ambitions had actually been ended. Ahmad Vahidi, commander-in-chief of Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, stated publicly, and for what was reported as the first time by any senior Iranian official, that Iran would continue developing nuclear capability as long as the United States and Israel possessed nuclear weapons of their own, adding that Iran would disarm only if they did first. It was a striking departure from decades of official Iranian messaging, which had consistently maintained that the country's nuclear program was purely civilian in nature, and that it had no ambition to build a weapon at all. For the first time, a senior figure inside Iran's most powerful military institution had openly tied the country's nuclear future to a demand for mutual disarmament. An admission, however framed, that a weapons ambition existed at all. This is where the honest answer to the question in this story's title has to sit with real uncertainty rather than a clean conclusion, because of the evidence points in more than one direction at once. American intelligence assessments, including the government's own annual threat assessment, had for years stated explicitly that Iran was not undertaking the specific technical activities needed to produce a testable nuclear device, even while it built up the enrichment capacity and expertise that would let it do so quickly if its leadership ever made that decision. That specific reassurance disappeared from the 2026 assessment entirely, replaced with vaguer language about monitoring Iran's weapons-related capabilities following the year's attacks, without directly addressing whether weapons development activity was underway. Independent analysts remain split. Some argue the physical destruction of enrichment infrastructure at Natanz, Fordow, and Isfahan, combined with the killing of the scientists who held the specialized knowledge to rebuild it, has set Iran's program back by years, regardless of political rhetoric. Others point to the unaccounted stockpile of highly enriched uranium, Iran's demonstrated ability under sanctions and isolation to rebuild centrifuge capacity before, and now Vahidi's own words, as evidence that intent has not been erased, only driven further underground and, if anything, hardened by the killing of the country's leadership and the loss of what officials in Tehran describe as national sovereignty. What nobody disputes is who bears the cost of this uncertainty in the meantime. Thousands of people have been killed across Iran, Israel, Lebanon, and the Gulf states since the war began, and millions have been displaced, according to reporting from the region compiled by outlets tracking the conflict's toll. American service members have died in retaliatory strikes far from either country's own soil. Protests against the war spread to multiple countries after Khamenei's killing, some opposing the loss of civilian life, others opposing what critics characterized as an act of regime change carried out by force, rather than through any process internal to Iran itself. Inside Iran, the succession crisis that followed Khamenei's death has left the government's own chain of command in a condition that outside analysts describe as without precedent since the 1979 revolution, with Mojtaba Khamenei's ascension to supreme leader lacking the kind of institutional legitimacy his father spent decades building. Whether that fragility makes a future nuclear weapons decision more or less likely is itself a matter of genuine debate among people who study the country closely. A weakened, cornered leadership might reach for the ultimate deterrent precisely because conventional options have narrowed, or it might be too consumed by internal survival to sustain the kind of long, expensive weapons program that requires exactly the stability it currently lacks. The war's economic and diplomatic ripple effects have reached well beyond the two countries most directly involved. The threatened closure of the Strait of Hormuz alone was enough to send global oil markets into volatile swings in the days after Khamenei's killing, since roughly a fifth of the world's traded petroleum and a substantial share of its liquefied natural gas pass through that narrow channel between Iran and Oman. Shipping insurers reportedly raised premiums for vessels transiting the Gulf, and several international carriers rerouted or paused voyages altogether during the war's most intense periods. Gulf states that had spent the better part of a decade quietly normalizing relations with Israel and cautiously managing their own rivalry with Tehran found themselves navigating a far more dangerous environment, caught between economic ties to both combatants and a genuine fear that any miscalculation could drag their own territory into direct fighting, a fear that appeared justified when strikes were reported reaching the United Arab Emirates during the February campaign. European governments, which had spent years trying to preserve some version of the JCPOA framework even after the American withdrawal, largely found themselves sidelined once fighting began, reduced to issuing statements calling for restraint while the war's central decisions were made in Washington, Jerusalem, and whatever remained of a functioning command structure in Tehran. The International Atomic Energy Agency, for its part, has been left trying to do its job almost blind. Inspectors were withdrawn from Iran following the 2025 strikes, and the agency's Director General, Rafael Grossi, has continued to warn that without full access to Iran's remaining facilities and stockpiles, no outside body can offer the kind of independent verification that once gave the world at least a partial, if imperfect, window into the program's true status. That is, in the end, the deepest unresolved thread running through this entire story. For years, the JCPOA gave inspectors real access, however contested, to measure Iran's program against its stated intentions. That access is largely gone now, destroyed along with much of the infrastructure it was meant to monitor, which means the world is left relying on satellite imagery, intercepted communications, and the occasional extraordinary public statement from officials like Vahidi to piece together a picture that used to come from direct inspection. What happens next depends on questions that remain genuinely open rather than settled by the events of 2026. Whether the unaccounted, highly enriched uranium stockpile still exists intact somewhere inside Iran, whether it can be recovered by international inspectors or Iranian technicians should either gain access again, and whether Iran's post-Khamenei leadership will treat Vahidi's public admission as the opening position in a future negotiation over mutual disarmament or as a signal of renewed resolve to build a weapon regardless of the cost already paid, are all questions without confirmed answers as of this writing. Sanctions relief, tied to the collapsed June memorandum, remains unresolved, and with it, the broader question of whether an economically devastated Iran has more incentive to negotiate away its remaining capability, or feeling it has already suffered the worst outside powers could inflict, less reason than ever to give up its last source of strategic leverage. Israeli officials continue to describe the campaign as having ended the immediate threat, while independent nonproliferation researchers continue to caution that ending a nuclear program requires more than destroying the buildings that house it. It requires accounting for every gram of material that was inside them, something that 6 months after the war's most dramatic strikes still has not happened in any verifiable, independently confirmed way. What this story ultimately traces is not a single red line crossed on a single day, but 3 decades of a threshold being approached, retreated from, and approached again through sabotage, diplomacy, war, and now the first open admission from inside Iran's own military that the ambition Israel spent 30 years trying to extinguish was never fully gone. The bombs fell, a supreme leader died, and an entire government's chain of command had to be rebuilt within days. And still, the question that started this shadow war in the first place, whether Iran will ultimately possess a nuclear weapon, remains exactly what it has always been, unanswered, contested. And now, for the first time in decades, being discussed openly by the very people once most determined to deny it.